That's the first time somebody's broken out a viola during a
That was
podcast
awesome.
with us.
Yes.
Just
I wish it happened every interview. That'd be great.
Welcome to The Pants Quandary, a podcast about how people navigate life with curiosity and creativity. And also where I get to be like Mr. Rogers, taking you on field trips to meet these people. I'm your host and resident nerd, Catherine Beeson. You can find me at catherinebeeson.com, or just find the link in the show notes. Happy nerding, stay curious. Today I'm joined on the pod by Dave Maass, who's an author, and Patrick Lay, who's an illustrator. Both of them who've created this wonderful book for those of you watching at home, Death Strikes, the Emperor of Atlantis. And we're going to be talking about this wonderful graphic novel and its origins and all of the things that it took to bring it into the world today. I want to start with a couple of quotes I found from you guys. Patrick, you have said, the history of resistance against oppression and censorship is ingrained in the world. And I think that is true, and it also sounds pretty depressing for such a weirdly uplifting graphic novel representation of this other art form we're going to get into. And then Dave, you have this excellent quote too. Written in a concentration camp, Peter Kien and Viktor Ullmann's opera is the truest form of artistic resistance, a middle finger to the Nazis and all authoritarians across history.
So my day job is at a nonprofit called the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where I lead our investigations unit. We're an organization that does civil liberties and human rights work when it comes to technology. And my role is specifically to investigate the use of surveillance technology. And we have a whole bunch of different stuff we're doing on that. I go down to the U.S.-Mexico border quite a lot to document surveillance technology there.
I love that your day job, so to speak, is about surveillance, and you've got this giant searchlight going on behind you the whole time. It's not creepy at all. I do love that you have a screensaver that is from the book, though. And I know you two don't know me very well, but I'm all about the middle finger. So this is great. It's going to be fun today. So Dave, in your quote, you mentioned that this was a work that was written in a concentration camp. It was a collaborative effort similar to the two of yours. Peter Kien was the librettist, and also it's my understanding that he did drawings for costume design and for set design. And then Viktor Ullmann was the collaborator that made the music to go along with it. And they themselves had a little bit of editing between them. It's my understanding. And then of course you had the censorship that happened in the concentration camp. So this is a multi-layered origin story that then you two took and created something new in this graphic novel, and you're very careful to call it an adaptation. So I don't know which one of you wants to start about what that means, how to adapt something into graphic novel format from an opera.
Well, I'll start, Patrick, if that's okay with you.
Yep, that's the right way.
Yeah, so I mean, I first learned about this opera a couple of decades ago, and it just captured my imagination. It's such a it's this story that's got a little bit of science fiction, a little bit of fantasy. It's got zombies in it. It's not everything that you don't expect to find in an opera is here, but everything that you might expect to find in a graphic novel is here. And so I always thought this needed a broader audience, and the graphic novel is just a great medium for doing something that's so imaginative, but doesn't, require like a huge, FX budget to make it happen. And so, we also had the benefit that Peter Kien was himself, even though he was a poet and a librettist, he was also a prolific illustrator and artist. So we also had some of his work to draw from as well. And, it just sort of made sense for us to take it and figure out how to make it work. There are some similarities between the two mediums in that things have to happen on a stage. Whereas like, in a graphic novel, they have to happen within cells, within panels. And I don't know, I'm going to let Patrick talk a little bit about, fitting it into the artistic format.
I mean, there are a lot of, with this work in particular, there are so many things to pull from. There's the history of the way it was made. There is the tradition of opera as a performance. There's, just 1,000 different ways to look at, to go, to kind of pull from and adapt. So, taking advantage of those things was really, really important. And it also, Dave had done a really tremendous job. One of the challenges with adapting an opera is that a lot of operas have a character walk on stage and they sing, and that is what happens. They sing, right? And we know that they're happy or they're sad or they're distraught or they're agonizing because the song tells us that, the music tells us that. And one of the things comics just doesn't have is sound. We could do sound effects, but we don't have a soundtrack to go off of. So figuring out what it is the characters are going to do in those moments, how are they going to demonstrate what it is the music would normally carry. Dave had already done an incredible amount of work kind of thinking about that and visualizing those things. And then on top of that, this particular work was written in a concentration camp. They didn't have so many resources. So a lot of what they describe as happening or describe kind of envisioning, we could bring to life. Like Dave said, we don't have an effects budget. It's just, whatever my hand can do is the limit. So, when you kind of reach out to all of those different points and you start pulling them in piece by piece, it gets denser and denser and denser, which is ideal, right? When you're coming from something that is placed in history, which has a tradition, and you want to do justice to what it should be. Like it should be dense. That's the perfect place for it to land.
So obviously, thinking about how this was an opera and you don't have the actual music in there, I noticed there are references to sound and to music, but without the obvious musical element in this kind of traditional sense, there still are kind of musical theater elements, of drama that I noticed. Like there's the carnival aria. Well, it seems like an aria to me on page 14 with the dumpster fire and the whole thing. I mean, it's just there's a lot of visual movement in that page, and many bubbles of the sort of what could be the moments from that aria, the lyrics from that aria. There's actual singing represented on the very next page. And then this montage on, I think it's page 17, into this kind of QVC patter number, into like establishing this duet that establishes both life and death and their irritation at how all of the days are the same. So days just don't even matter anymore, And it does really have a QVC kind of feel to it. I loved that. And it's, I just don't know if that was an organic idea that kind of came to the two of you, or how much work did it take to come to that, to bring those kind of musical elements into the book?
So, with the first act, so even within the opera itself, that first scene is the most fleshed out part of the book. It was very easy for us to adapt that section. We didn't have to add a lot. We had to interpret a lot, but in other parts, we did have to add some dialogue. We did have to stretch some things out. In that section, we were able to follow it pretty well, and we're hoping that people who are familiar with the opera are very, know what we did and know that they're like, oh, wow, they took this section and they did. You talked about the patter shopping sequence where they're doing like a home shopping there, but we're adapting them. They in the actual opera, they're doing like a kind of snake oil salesman kind of street fair type of thing. But we wanted to update it a little bit, but it is that same pop, 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 pop that's actually happening vocally. And then the whole, beginning section is, this character of life who's wandering around moaning and whining about how much life sucks these days because everything's war. And you can see that kind of flow and that dance that he does. The character does in that section. And then even with the second scene where we have the Emperor, in his own cell, and it's a very talky part of this opera. Like there isn't a ton of singing in that section. There's a little bit, but not a huge amount. And we're hoping that also came across as well, the claustrophobic element of it, the very businesslike element of it. But wherever we could find something, we were able to put it in there. You know, there's a lullaby that happens, like this kind of creepy lullaby that happens in the fourth scene. I was very adamant about getting that in there. So, you know, if you are familiar with it, it'll work for you. And I'm very proud that if you actually like read the first scene while playing the opera, it should actually pretty much line up as you're working it out. After that, it kind of gets, you know, like it stops being in sync. But at least that first section is pretty close, I think, for most people.
Yeah, I mean, as a someone who comes from a music world and primarily a classical music world, I really appreciated kind of feeling these musical elements while I'm reading the novel. You know, it made a lot of immediate sense to me, even before I was very, very familiar with the particular opera. It felt musical, and so I was just really pleased with that and very taken by it. I see lots of smiling.
No, that's awesome. That was intentional. It's you know, when you're reaching for all these different things, there are rhythms and there are motifs, and there are ways that you can take. You know, I teach comics, so I think about like how to do this a lot. And there are ways to take things like rhythm and musicality and make it a visual element and make it so that there's a rhythm across a page that bounces or moves and comes along with the eye, and then, you know, continuing to repeat those things. That there are the points definitely that you pulled out, all top notch, awesome, A pluses. But there's also this several beat fight argument that happens in 3 different points throughout the book. Life and death fight over a sword, and then these other 2 characters fight over a gun, and then these other 2 characters who are, you know, basically zombies, are just tearing at each other until they fall into each other's arms, you know. And both of all those things, those are the motifs, right? They're ways to repeat that musicality, to bring that thread back in, to represent like, here's that same battle happening over and over again, but changing and becoming something else. Which, you know, if you're really, really lucky, people see it. It's there whether people see it or not. But if you're lucky, people can find it.
Yeah, I think, you know, just visually for me, there's just a lot of variation, and that kind of variation, I think, really lends itself to the push and pull of poetry, the push and pull or the flow of music, just kind of the way that we, you know, even move throughout our days, right? Sometimes it's frenetic, sometimes it's just plain boring, you know? And so you have to have these moments, whether it's high or low drama, you have to have these moments, I think, of rest and also of activity. And that really comes across in the book in some beautiful ways.
I think one of the biggest thing, the thing that I was so adamant about, is that the probably the most memorable few notes in this opera for anyone is the hello, hello, which happens over and over again, particularly whenever the loudspeaker speaks. And I was like, we have to have it in there. In fact, that's the one thing we're not going to translate from German into English. We're going to keep the hello with the A in there. But you know, we really labored on how that should look. And you know, it was funny because our letterer was like the first time he's ever been given like musical cues on how the text should look and how his like typography, and he was like very amused by it, that I'd be like sending him like Spotify links. I'm like, this is what hello, hello sounds like. That's also how I want it to look.
You know, it's funny that you mention it, because I have a viola here that looks. This is like, you know, when people go fishing and they want the fish to look massive. There's no way for me to make this look normal on screen, but you know, that hello, hello is constructed. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm getting really nerdy right here. That hello, hello is constructed in such a way that it's a combination of 2 really awkward intervals, which you probably already knew because you've been working on this thing for 150,000 years. But there it is, you know? And so that rising hello and then hello kind of opens the door and then like closes it, getting ready for whatever the new very scary, crazy announcement is going to come out of that loudspeaker. And there are plenty of crazy, scary announcements that come. The mirror in the Emperor's tower. When the cover is finally pulled off of the mirror, and we have that interaction between Death and the Emperor. It's really important to the story in the opera, and also the way that you've adapted it into the graphic novel. But here I want to ask, when Death moves into the mirror, Death's reflection is a little different. And, there are elements that look like Mercury or Achilles, but also I noticed his sword has that medical symbol of the wings and snakes, and so I wanted to know what was happening there.
So in the score and libretto, there's a part that talks about in this section you're talking about that Death is slowly transforming into Hermes, the god who's transporting people to, the afterlife. And there's no stage directions about how this happens or what this looks like. And I don't think I've seen a production on video or played out where they actually honored that. But I think the idea here is that there's a new Death. That what we're talking about is a rebirth of Death. This is not the old, tired Death. This is not the death of a lot of war. This is a death that is new, young, a new way of thinking about death, and it is a positive thing, bringing people into the afterlife, and it is that sense of relief. So we did want to get that in there, and it was really important to me that all of the characters there's only 6 characters in this, and a couple of side characters that we kind of fleshed out as well. I wanted everybody to have an arc in this, because they actually don't in the opera itself. Like, Death does have in the sense that he comes out and he comes back, but everybody I felt like needed to change a little bit on this. And specifically, I felt like it couldn't just be Death back to business as normal. I wanted to show that Death itself had gone through a change.
I didn't write it, I didn't choose the scene, but I have a lot of strong feelings about it, right? And for me, so much of this as a story is about having a good death, right? Like that's the thing they win at the end. It's not that everybody gets to go back to living, it's that everybody who's died gets to die, and that makes life better. So this idea of a new death or a better death, in even that whole aria where he describes himself and he's this festival, he's the biggest festival, and the release that the afraid, scared little animals in their burrows look for, it's all the characterization of Death is this very particular perspective that's very, very different than a human perspective. About what he thinks is good and what he thinks is bad. And it's even in that section, which is poetic, and it sounds nice. There are parts that are terrifying. Like he does not at all shy away from I am scary. Even though he's like, I'm not the curse. I'm the thing that relieves the curse, So there's these weird, I love that Death was written in such a way that he has his own internal psychology of what is good and what is bad based around what his function is. And that comes out in that scene. And then there's that transformation, which, we definitely try to figure out a delicate way to do it. And I think playing with the mirror returning to a reflective state was part of it. Having him walk through the mirror, because when they first open it up, it's a hollow portal into a dark, smoky realm. And having it to return to physicality and having it catch glimpses of him as he's this different thing passing through was our kind of visual way to cue off of that, and hopefully not cause too much interruption in the reading experience, right? Because it's weird and it doesn't have a great answer just yet. It's a place for you to kind of fill in if you want to. So yeah,
that's definitely how it felt to me. I looked at that for quite a while, and it really struck me, I think, because people are also afraid of doctors. We need healing, we need release. So death and this healing are kind of combined in that moment. And I thought that was really interesting. Plus, I know it doesn't seem like Death has the ability to have facial expressions, but he just seems so relieved You know, he seems so relieved to, like, you know, to have these two sides of him that people can be, you know, celebrating now for him.
Yeah, there's the story has all those reversals though, right? Like life is campaigning for death to resume, and the army medic is, you know, like, and the worker who is combative have these different antagonistic relationships, and they kind of keep flip-flopping and doing these unexpected things, which almost all comes from directly from the opera. I mean, it's pretty fascinating stuff.
It is, and I do love, Dave, that you. I did get a lot of middle finger about the drummer rejoicing after this change at the end. You know, that she can report truth now. You know, I got a lot of middle finger on that one, so I hope that was a good read. I think too the struggle between life and death is such a you know, an I mean, it's a major driver of this story. I love the way that that they have a kind of a camaraderie, even though they're after different means. One of the things that struck me, that life was making a portal, sort of, you know, ripping open the scene and then stepping through. And I wondered if you wanted to speak about that, how that idea came in.
Oh, well, that one was we needed a mechanism for this character to move around from the real world to this netherworld, because that scene is supposed to take place in like this in-between nowhere space. And we couldn't have an entire chapter of this character just sitting in the void. And so we wanted to establish the city of Atlantis. We needed to do it early, so we needed this character to be walking around. And then I was like, well, how do we end up with, you know, going from the real world to this world where we have flaming dumpster carousels? And that's where I was like, okay, we'll have this character moving around. And that actually solved a whole lot of other problems that we had throughout the rest of the book, because we needed life to be in all these different places. You know, I think when you have an opera, people with science fiction and fantasy, people are willing to like suspend their disbelief. But with an opera, they're willing to like just chuck it all together. You can just be like, well, we introduced this cell where no one could get in. How did life get in? Who cares how life got into there? Who cares where these characters are moving around from? Like, but we're like, no, we have to answer these questions. And so we created this portal because that was kind of the easiest way to have this character moving from scene to scene, and also to show that this character is of both worlds. They are able to exist in the real world, the terrestrial world, and they're able to exist on this sort of more spiritual plane.
You're speaking so much about the ideas that you made together. Dave, did you have any of this kind of written already, as an, you know, coming from the point of view of the author? Did you have a lot of it fleshed out before you started working with Patrick?
Only the first section or so, only the first scene, you know, which was pretty easy to do. I had most of it done. I think I had probably like half of it or 3/4 of it done at the point when I approached Patrick, because I'd had enough to give it to our wonderful character designer, Ezra Rose. Ezra was able to you know, do a lot with it there. And then we did, you know, a series of tryouts with various artists and I gave them like a section. I'm like, here, pick a page from this section that I've written. And a couple of folks we had try out, chose some, you know, decent pages, but Patrick probably chose the hardest page of all of the ones in there. You'll see it in the book. It is a double-page spread. It wasn't originally a double-page spread. It was just a single-page spread it's when Death is complaining, talking about his history. He's like, everything was, you know, back in the day when he was with like Hannibal, or he was with, you know, Genghis Khan. That was, you know, really great. And then it's slowly, as he's moving down the page, like, you know, he's riding with his horse. He actually has to say goodbye to his horse because his horse is too tired to go on. And there's tank. That was Patrick's first page. And when Ezra and I looked at this, it was just phenomenal. It was just phenomenal.
Yeah, I mean, it really comes through. This is Death's first really big aria. I mean, look at, I don't know the opera that well, but as far as the graphic novel is concerned, this is Death's real chance to say, who I am and what's pissing me off right now, right? He gets into it. If only you could have seen me, I couldn't have enough war, right? So it all starts kind of here, but then by the time you get just one page later, look at all of this. This is amazing. I mean, I'm mostly doing this for the people at home. You guys have seen this 1,000 times, but it's just everywhere all at once, but also reads really logically, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but it's very easy to follow, but also you can kind of take it all in. And it's like the amount of frustration that he has and the memory of the good times, kind of mixing in with all of the frustration that he's feeling now about just this endless, what does he call it? These working conditions. There's unfair working conditions,
Unfair killing conditions.
Yes, unfair killing conditions.
Yes.
Killing conditions, that's right. And he, even when he breaks his sword, he puts the sign on it so he can go and protest. I think that it's such an interesting way to make that leap, that adaptation leap. So then how did it go from there? Were you in the next scenes, were you working mostly together, or was it sort of passing ideas back and forth? How did that work?
Well, but before we get to that, I do want to give like a little behind the scenes on that particular page, because I don't think I've talked about this before, but I figure I came to mind, so I would share it with your listeners. So in that scene, in the original opera, Death talks about how he goes over 3 distinct characters from history that he'd gone on. And I don't remember exactly which of the 3 they were. They've kind of gotten jumbled in my mind. But one of them, I think, is like Hannibal. And then the next one is like Attila or something like that. Attila the Hun. And then the third is like, it's like, I rode with the tigers of Denginar or Denganir or something like that. And I have no idea who that is. No matter how much research, how much different types of spelling, looking for like famous warlords who rode tigers, I don't know where he pulled that from, Peter Kien. And I've seen like other people adapt it and they just throw it in there like, well, whatever. He clearly thought this was something. And I was looking at that and I'm like, all right, I can't, people are going to, like, I got stuck on it because I'm like, I don't know who this person, and other people will. And I was like, also, it makes sense that if you're going to be telling the story of, like, famous warlords, you do have to do the trio of Genghis Khan, Attila the Hun, and Hannibal. Those 3 make sense. And so that's why we don't, if you're listening to it live, you'll be like, what's this tiger thing? Why didn't we have the tigers in there? And as much as I would have loved to have Patrick draw somebody riding a tiger, I can't really give Patrick guidance on what this person should look like if I can't actually confirm they exist in any form at all.
That's pretty wild. I mean, Patrick, did you want to give it a try anyway?
I mean, I would love to draw people riding tigers. That sounds amazing. But we had enough work to do, Yeah.
We had small horses and elephants to do,
Yeah, and horses are notoriously difficult to draw because they're just, everything about them's backwards. They're really strange, spindly creatures where all the weight's way up off the ground and their ankles are really tiny. And but you had mentioned earlier about ideas kind of flowing back and forth, and in comics, a traditional setup is that the writer will write the script and kind of set all of those things down and pass it off to the artist, who will interpret it, and then there'll be an editor as a mediator kind of in there as well. And we more or less followed that, but it was really collaborative, which was really, really awesome. When there were problems, like, we would work together through the problems. When our editor had problems that we did not anticipate, we're like, we just thought this made perfect sense. And to her, she was like, I don't know what this is. We got to like work through what that would be, like what that meant and how we would solve that problem and make it, legible. Or like even the portals that life was making to move through, like there's an internal consistency in like the logic of the world, which, we all kind of had to kind of agree upon was true, and then make sure that we stuck to it, because if there's a point where suddenly life has superpowers, then we got to explain how that happened if they didn't have superpowers before. So a lot of the back and forth collaborative stuff from a story standpoint were things like that. It was stuff like, well, if they're here, then how did they get here, and why are they there, and how did they get to the next place? But then past that, there's also the visual storytelling things of like, I see this character in this place, and now suddenly they're in this place. How did they get from A to B, without interrupting the flow of the story or the rhythm of things? And my goodness, that part of it took months. It took 3 months at least. I thought it was going to be weeks, and it took 3 months, but it was collaborative. It was awesome. Like, we would get on the calls, and it was Dave and Karen, our editor, Karen Berger is a legend, and and we would just go page for page, panel for panel, working through, like, is this what's going on? I think sometimes if Karen would have had her druthers, we would have strayed even further away from the source material, but it was always like clawing some things back, like, no, that's not how it is. We gotta come back closer to where it started. But collaboration's like a really interesting, weird thing, so that you come to the project with a lot of your own ideas, and all of you ends up in it, but it gets so intermingled with what everybody else is bringing in that it's like, it could be hard to remember what's what.
Well, I mean, that draws me back to, not to make a terrible pun, that makes me recall, there we go, I'm going to get away from draws. That makes me recall the Kien 6-panel cartoon, right? So it starts off with his illustration of death, looking very stoic, and he's got the long coat, hat, everything's kind of dark, and little bits and pieces of the costuming are torn away until all you get is the teeny tiny little skeleton that's inside there. He doesn't look very formidable anymore. And he's now wearing, is it a ballerina's costume, and a mask?
Flower crown.
Yes, and a flower crown.
Mask.
And so he's completely transformed into something the complete opposite of what he started out as. And it's humorous, but also really, really speaks to the artistic process and how difficult it is to make compromises. And so I wonder how much compromise had to happen on your end of things, the two of you, that you maybe feel like you feel some twinge of regret about. Is there anything, or are you pretty happy with the way it came out?
So I am absolutely happy with the way it came out. I have no qualm. I mean, like, in the end, we were very lucky to land with Karen Berger, who was like, I'm going to help you make the book that you want to make. We didn't end up with an editor who didn't care about the thing. It was just signed to work with us and get it done quickly. Like, she was all in on helping us achieve our vision. The only things I have regrets on, more or less, are just things that I've did. Like, a year and a half later, I'll be sitting there watching, the opera being performed in Mahlerfest, and I'll be like, oh, now that I'm sitting here watching it performed, I could have done this section a little bit differently, or I could have fix this problem, with a little bit less words, or things like that. I mean, but we didn't really have, at our disposal at the time, the ability to sit down and just like command people to perform it for us so we could get our ideas. But I think when you have an opera like this, you do see different things. It does make you think about it differently every time you see it. But, like, I could have dawdled over my script for like 8 years, and never put out the book, and maybe I would feel like it was perfect at that point, but probably not. It would always have something that I would want to change. Patrick's probably going to tell you that there was things he wanted to draw better, but to be honest, Patrick's going to say that, but nobody other than Patrick will have noticed. Like, if he makes an error, only he notices in it, so...
Yeah, I mean, I will say finished is better than perfect, and I'm much more happy that the book exists and is in the world than I got to redraw the 6 panels that are haunting the back of my brain forever. I did get to redraw several things, and I got to a point where, like, it was like, well, nobody's gonna care, nobody's gonna notice, and we're ready to go on this book. It's like, yeah, okay, cool, and then you see it later, and you're like, oh man, I could have redrawn that. I think if I had, I have no regrets about the compromise aspect of it at all. I think that almost I love collaborating in general, and I think it almost always makes the thing better to get more eyes to like test ideas out, to refine and refine and refine. If I had to make one change, there's one page I wish was a 2-page spread. If I could just add one page, I could make it a 2-page spread. It'd be so much more impactful.
Just to be clear, like, that makes me, like, if you detected me, like, cringe a little bit, that's because every time we want to add you can't just add one page, as Patrick knows.
You have to.
Because if you add one page, then you've messed up all of the double page spreads that happen after that. So that's actually coming up and fabricating a whole nother page of the book somewhere. If not 2 more pages, because if you actually want to add actual pages to the book, you can't add 1 page, you can't add 2 pages, you have to add 4 pages to the book. So it's funny because it's like you want to add, because Karen during the process only time in my life have I had an editor tell me to write more. Like only one time, and that's Karen Berger saying, hey, this one should have more text, we should take this page and we should make it a double page spread, and which was often like, oh, well, I have to do 2 pages, and I have to figure out someplace else to put it in another page.
That is something that I did not consider, because it seems really very specific to this medium. You know, I mean, look, there's all kinds of ways to lay music out on a page, and you want to be able to make sure that the places for page turns are not in an awkward middle of something really important. But that's just a matter of, you know, slightly enlarging or scrunching a few things here and there, and just kind of, you know, it's not like adding 1 page equals 4 pages kind of problem. That is a big problem.
Yeah, and whether a page is on the left or right really matters too, because it affects whether the thing was hidden behind the page turn, right? And so like what you get is a nice reveal, and then if you get that beautiful 2-page spread, now you have all this information to take in before you flip the page again. If I remember correctly, Dave, wasn't there a pass on the script where you had to go back and be like, left page, right page, left page, right page, right page, yeah, just to make sure that you had them all arranged in the way you
I think our page numbering has that in there, because I couldn't keep it in my head, and I needed to know. Mostly I needed to know what was going to be at the bottom. The most important thing was what ended the bottom right page, like, and what started the top left page, because you always, like, I always wanted to make sure whenever possible, that you get to the bottom right page, the bottom right corner of a page, and you want to turn the page. Like I want to force you to turn the page. Just like a lot of Netflix shows have a really, like, crummy last scene that, like, they did not have to have a clean cliffhanger, but they really just don't want you to stop binging. It's like, that's what I wanted. Is I didn't want, the only place that I wanted you as a reader to feel comfortable putting it down and coming back to it later is at the end of the chapter break, which, to be honest, none of them should take you more than 15 minutes to get through anyways, you know. So that was my hope, at least.
I'm hearing that there were some problem-solving, moments that had to be met kind of consistently, but it wasn't ever a thing where you just said, "Forget it, I'm not doing this." It's you had pretty good support from the editor, it sounds like. And how was it finding a publisher for this thing? Did you have? I don't know how any of this works, so please help me. Did you have that kind of lined up to begin with? Did you have to pitch to a lot of people? Were you really far along before you were seeking publishing?
The idea was to start getting together what's called a pitch packet, which I would use to find an agent. So that involved having Ezra draw up all of the character designs. I commissioned Patrick to do 12 pages, like as finished as he could get them. And then this whole just sort of guide of here's what the whole story looks like, here's the background, here's what we think the market looks like. And then I used that to find an agent. And then we worked with Madison to put together a list of publishers that we thought it might be good for based on what they'd published in the past. And then we kind of threw Karen Berger, who has her own imprint called Berger Books, which is part of Dark Horse Comics. I kind of added her to the list because I had interviewed her in a journalistic capacity for a piece for the Daily Beast like a year or two earlier, and she was so smart and she had such a vision. She saw her comics in this like, you know, broader context as commentary in society, but also at the same time, I really didn't necessarily know that our book really matched her aesthetic and the things that she'd been publishing in the past, or at least of recent, what she'd been publishing. But it's like, let's pitch it anyways. And, you know, we got rejection. And then I think over like Christmas break, we get like an email from a very apologetic email from Karen saying, I'm sorry, I missed this email earlier, but I finally got around to this and I want to publish this book. And it wasn't like, it was very, she really wanted to do it. Like, and we were all just sort of shocked. I remember calling Patrick or messaging Patrick and him freaking out a little bit because it was, I mean, if you're not in comics, like, I don't know who the equivalent person to work with is in classical music, but like, there are very few editors whose names are as recognizable as Karen Berger's if you're in comics. I mean, Patrick, if you could talk a little bit about why she's so famous.
I mean, she is an absolute legend. She started her career with DC Comics and kind of early on there, even working with like Wonder Woman, really brought a sophistication to those genres. And then ultimately she ended up with her own imprint called Vertigo Comics, where she brought in a ton of comic writers and artists from the UK in particular, but really transformed the way that the comics industry saw itself. The idea that comics could be adult and literary and dense and have a lot of leg room to say things and not just be adventure stories or power fantasies. The success of her work is it's kind of incalculable, and comics are today in the United States what they are because of Karen Berger's editorial voice. And it was very much her preference, her voice, her thumbprint on all of these pieces, not just because she was a collaborative editor, but because she's a keen eye for talent, which is not a self-congratulatory thing. It just is true. So many amazing comic writers and artists, they began their career with Karen Berger. So yeah, when Karen Berger sends you an email and doesn't say in the email, hey, maybe we'll do this, let's meet up and we'll talk about it, but says like, we're going to meet up to talk about how we do this. You know, that's a very different tone. That's very different than we anticipated too, because, you know, if Karen Berger wants it, I think we're just going to give it to Karen Berger.
Yeah, there's no question. When, you know, it's hard to imagine like, you know, anybody else acquiring this. I mean, once she wanted. I mean, I think that if somebody came in and was like, we'll give you $10 million to make this book, then Patrick would be like, okay, well, that's $10 million. But like, you know, having Karen working on your book is like a $9.9 million offer just on its own.
It sounds to me like this whole thing was charmed from the beginning, but there must have been a while, Dave, especially. It sounds like you were putting up your own personal capital, at least in the very, very beginning, to get Ezra on board, and then to commission Patrick, get the packet together, and that kind of thing. To have that kind of commitment to this process and to the story and to the adaptation of this, you know, original material. I mean, it's my understanding that you discovered the original material, you know, when you were quite young, and it kind of stuck with you all this time. This is your first graphic novel to author, yes?
Yeah, that's correct.
And how did it grab you? Like, at what point did you say, this is a thing that I'm doing?
This is something that, you know, from like basically the moment discovering it, I was like, I want to do something else with this. But it did take me a long time to get to a place in my professional career where I felt confident enough to do it, where I had the wherewithal to do it, where I just sort of knew, not necessarily how to do it, but I knew how to find out how to do it. I knew how to strategically go about doing it. And I think that's kind of where Patrick, I mean, it's interesting, like how Patrick and I met, is that one of the things I did along the way is I went to this event called Alaska Robotics Comics Camp. And I'm going to let Patrick tell a little bit about it, because he has like a good storytelling manner when it comes to Alaska Robotics.
Yeah, well, the Alaska Robotics shop and gallery is that it's a gallery in Juneau, Alaska, and it's also a comic shop. And the guys who ran that shop, they've been meeting people because they're just incredibly nice, genuine people, and inviting them up to Juneau, Alaska, which is one of the most beautiful places on earth. It's incredible. And then they decided to make it like, hey, let's make this an official thing. So they run this small convention, and then everybody piles into a van, and we drive out to a camp, and camp out in basically a Boy Scout camp in Alaska for like 3 or 4 days, right? And it's almost like this kind of retreat of all comics makers, comics adjacent people, and it's people of all career levels too, which is one of the things that makes it really, really special. So Dave and I met there, and it was one of the last nights that we were there, kind of out on the back patio, and we'd probably met several times before that, but it was out there that Dave kind of told me what it was that brought him to camp, because he'd been a journalist covering comics, but like, why is he here today? And he's telling me all about this opera, which I'd never heard of, but it's just so incredible. The backstory of the opera just adds so much to the content of it, right? But the content is also fascinating. So even that trek of getting to the point where we're connected to start moving even further is its own kind of set of serendipitous events.
For sure. I mean, I would think, if you have that idea kind of planted in there, then you are also remaining kind of open to finding the people, even sometimes by accident, that you can network with that will either get you closer to your goal or work with you on your goal, right? So I'm sure all of that was just kind of bubbling in maybe not even in all the way back of your mind, but maybe the middle part. It's good that you mentioned, Patrick, the context that the opera comes from. So we mentioned already that it was written in a concentration camp. It was in Terezin concentration camp, where a lot of artists and musicians and poets and quite a lot of queer folk were funneled. This was just in the weeks leading up to both Peter Kien and Viktor Ullmann being transferred to Auschwitz. So they had started to mount the production, is that correct? And then, but they never managed to finish it. How far along did they get, or do you know?
I think what we know is that they started rehearsals. Like, I mean, everybody had been cast for it. We know that there were people who'd been practicing the music for it. What we don't know is exactly why it was never performed. There are some theories that maybe the Nazis came in and brutalized everyone once they figured out what it was about. Other theories is that, there just wasn't enough people, that people kept getting sent, to the east and on trains, and that they just didn't have enough musicians or singers to stage even such a small performance. There's all sorts of things. I mean, things could have just happened on camp, like resources, maybe lost access to the room. You just never quite know what had happened. Like, I sometimes just sit and I speculate on it, and like one of my pet sort of theories, which is, based on very little, is that we do have this version of the opera, of the libretto, that it's typed out. It's not even called, Der Kaiser von Atlantis. It's called Der König von Atlantis. It's the King of Atlantis. It is so dulled down. It's so much shorter and so much more basic that it's lost a lot of its teeth. Part of me wonders if, they just abandoned it because at that point it just stunk. That it just wasn't their vision anymore, that there wasn't a point in doing it if it wasn't going to be as satirical and scathing as because both of these men were just super uncompromising in their vision, and I could not imagine them moving forward on something that they did not feel like they were 100% behind. But all of this is lost to history. We don't have the benefit of asking people, what happened here. It's all gone now.
Yeah, there's even, an account of a German security officer attending one of the final rehearsals, but where the documentation for that lives, like who says that happened, is really hard to track down. I mean, I haven't actually, Dave, maybe you have. I haven't read anything that says I saw this happen. That did happen, but I have heard several things repeating. It's said that this happened.
Yeah.
So it's really hard. It's so hard to know for certain.
Yeah.
I think getting back to your quote, Patrick, the history of resistance against oppression and censorship is ingrained in the world. And also because this podcast series is a little bit about problem seeking and problem solving, and just the ways that we find our way forward. It is interesting that the manuscript, the libretto and the musical manuscript were smuggled out somehow, saved, smuggled out, and then made available, for performances long after both of these guys were killed. But then it lives further in your adaptation. And I think that the two really complement each other very beautifully. If we have some unanswered questions, they're addressed in a very generalized way because of the source material and because of its continued growth. Plus, it's terrible, but it's true. All of these things, authoritarianism, totalitarianism, are as relevant today as they were then. And so it's a great way to... I think it's a great way to revisit these things in relative safety.
Oh, I would love to talk about the Louisville performance for a second, if that's okay. So while we were still putting together the book, we were approached by Adam Milstein, who manages the Recovered Voices Project at Colburn College, which is the music school in Los Angeles. And the Recovered Voices Project is dedicated to uplifting the works of creators who had been suppressed by the Nazis, whose careers had been cut short. And, I had been seeking advice from Adam Milstein and his predecessor, Bob Elias, for quite some time for background on this book. And they just happened to bring this up with Louisville Orchestra about who was going to be performing this opera, and said, hey, this would be great for a collaboration. Also, it's a pretty inexpensive way to stage a giant science fiction, fantasy, otherworldly opera. And so Patrick and I got to go to Louisville and see this come to life, in which, the way I've tried to describe it to people who are not familiar with opera, and maybe not even familiar with comics, is that if you imagine that, Take Me On video, the famous video of, the girl and, falling in love with a comic character and going into the comic world, that is kind of how it felt. It actually looked at many times like our characters had entered our comic book. These performers, and they were all wearing our costumes. A lot of them were actually doing the same kind of choreography and movements that we had drawn in the book, and certainly their characterization, the flair that they gave, was based on ours. And it was just so stunning to see this sort of very full circle. I use that term a lot, but this sort of full circle back to this this opera. It's back on the stage. But not only that, seeing Peter Kien's original sort of idea for what death should look like actually on stage for what I think was the first time was just a hugely rewarding moment. But Patrick, you should talk a little bit, because it was your art that was 4 stories high.
Truly bananas, right? It was being projected on the scrim, and they were lighting it from behind so they could insert characters into the images, and all of those things really got kind of combined and mishmashed and cut together into this thing that was incredibly recognizable as the graphic novel. And it was a really, really satisfying experience to have folks both before and afterwards who had seen it, they understood it, right? It was in German, but they knew beat for beat, line for line, what was happening because of the way these two pieces of media were interacting, right? And again, having the performers interpret the scenes the way that we had drawn them out, because there are 1,000 ways to interpret anything, was really, really spectacular. And the production team, which had come out of the Atlanta Opera, really knocked it out of the park. And we were involved in a lot of the early ideation And so that was also really fascinating, because you take the thing that you worked on and then all these meetings where you're in PowerPoints being like, what if this thing happens? And then you give it to top tier talent and they're like, yeah, that thing happened, but like really good at 2 stories tall, 35 feet wide, across the stage, just with the full orchestra on stage right there, like performing with the actors. So yeah, really beautiful. Very, very cool.
Yeah. And I think what really works between these like 2 mediums together is that it's a very short opera. It's like 50 minutes or something like that. And it has packed in so much storytelling, so much meaning, that I think like audiences do have a little bit of a difficulty taking it all in and processing it, especially since they're having to like experience it in another language most of the time. But a lot of the audience who go to see this are not like, I mean, we're kind of like past the time where like opera is a popular art and everybody's familiar with opera, right? And like people are going to the opera all the time, for better or worse. But a lot of people who go to this specific one are not necessarily people who've been to an opera before. It might be their first opera, or they've barely seen any. And so that also is like a challenge for them to process the medium. So being able to have a book to go to afterwards that they're able to revisit and think about it, I think that has made a huge difference for people to be able to process this work.
All right. Well, thank you so much to the both of you for talking through your process and letting us into the world of Death Strikes, for joining the podcast, and also the beautiful work that you both are so committed to in this world. And best of luck to both of you.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And that's the episode. Huge thanks to Dave Maass and Patrick Lay for making something so powerful, for joining me to share about it, and for being excited about me randomly singing and bringing a viola into the discussion. Do make sure to find their really excellent graphic novel, Death Strikes, The Emperor of Atlantis, published by Dark Horse Comics. Look for a link to that and to the source material opera by Peter Kien and Viktor Ullmann in the show notes. The Pants Quandary is a brand new podcast. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Matthew Ward for the cover art, to Jessica Mays for composing and mixing the theme music, to Susanna Klein, Sonia Stith-Williams, and Jordan Gunn for recording it, and to my cat Roxy for reminding me I've been sitting down too long obsessing over the editing process. Or maybe she's hungry. Either way, it's nice having a cat. If you like what I'm up to, please consider becoming a Backstage Pass subscriber. Your support helps keep me going, literally and figuratively. I'll be back with another episode in 2 weeks. Until then, talk to strangers, listen to children, touch some plants, and go find the sun on your face for a minute or two.